On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched the Sputnik 1. It was the world's first artificial satellite and was about the size of a beach ball. It was a polished metal sphere with 4 external radio antennae to broadcast radio pulses. It was 22.8 inches in diameter and weighed only 183.9 pounds and took about 98 minutes to orbit the Earth, traveling at 18,000 miles per hour. Immediately after the Sputnik 1 was launched, the U.S. Defense Department approved funding for another U.S. satellite project. The United States then started working on the Explorer project. The launch of the Sputnik marked the start of the space race because the public feared that the Soviets could launch ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear weapons. The Soviets struck again on November 3rd. The Sputnik 2 was launched carrying a much heavier payload, including a dog named Laika. The Sputnik 2 was 6 times as heavy as the Sputnik 1, coming in at over 1,100 pounds. Unfortunately, there was no plan to get the dog back safely, and it later died in space. On January 31st, 1958, the U.S. successfully launched the Explorer 1, which carried a small scientific payload. The Explorer 1 ended up discovering the Van Allen radiation belts. The Sputnik launch also led directly to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA. In July of 1958, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which created NASA as of October 1st, 1958.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a conflict between the U.S. and the Soviets in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba. With this, the U.S. agreed to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's offer to remove Cuban missiles in exchange for the U.S. not invading the Cuban territory. Fidel Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union, and under his rule, Cuba was dependent on the Soviets for military and economic aid. This turn of events soon led the U.S. and Soviets clashing in what is known as the Cold War, which was a political and economic conflict between 1945 to 1991. One of the factors that went into the Cold War was due to American spies flying over Cuba and photographing a Soviet medium-range ballistic missile being assembled. Once Kennedy learned of the American spies, he called a group of advisors who fought for diplomatic crisis within the Soviet Union. Their solution was to employ the U.S. Navy to create a blockade, while Kennedy notified Americans that he would be using military force to neutralize the threat to national security. However, on October 24th, Soviet ships bound for Cuba and came close to the U.S. blockade. This turn of events led to Khrushchev's decision, in which he offered to remove Cuban missiles in exchange for the U.S. not invading Cuba. Therefore, the Soviet Union would dismantle their missiles in Cuba if the U.S. removed their missiles in Turkey, which later led the nations to sign the treaty related to nuclear weapons, which ended the crisis for good.
ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, a land-based nuclear-armed ballistic missile with over a range of 3,500 miles. For years after World War II, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had been trying to perfect a long-range missile capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Building on the success of Nazi Germany in developing the V-1 and V-2 rockets, both American and Russian scientists raced to improve the range and accuracy of such missiles. Both nations relied heavily on captured German scientists. In July 1957, the U.S. seemed to win the race when the Atlas, an ICBM with a speed of up to 20,000 miles per hour and an effective range of 5,000 miles, was ready for testing. The test, however, was a disaster. The missile rose 5,000 feet in the air before falling back to Earth. A month later, the Soviets claimed success by announcing that their own ICBM had been tested and had covered a huge distance in a brief time. It had landed in the target area, or so they had said. No details were given in the Russian announcement, and some commentators in the U.S. doubted the ICBM test had been as successful as claimed. Nevertheless, the Soviet possession of this ultimate weapon, coupled with recent successful tests by the Russians of atomic and hydrogen bombs, raised concerns in America. If the Soviets did indeed perfect the ICBM, no part of the United States would be completely safe from possible atomic attack. On September 12, 1962, Kennedy gave a speech in Houston, Texas, at Rice University. In his speech, he said, We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one in which we intend to win. In this speech, he's encouraging the American people to go further from what we know and to explore and improve all of our technologies.
Other firsts include the dog Lakita that launched on board the Soviet Union's Sputnik 2 spacecraft on November 3, 1957. On June 11, 1948, Albert I, or Reese's monkey, became the first monkey launched into space on board the U.S.-launched V-2 rocket. April 12th was a huge day for Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin in 1961 became the first man in space, making a 108-minute orbital flight in his Vestal 1 spacecraft. Cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova became the first female cosmonaut to go into space on June 16th, 1963, aboard the Vestal 6.